Today we're going to define what transgenderism actually is through three philosophical perspectives, how those perspectives demonstrate its incoherence and incompatibility with the leftist ideology which champions transgenderism, and practical applications for thinking Christianly about this concept. Transgenderism is the notion that a human being is a gender other than the gender assigned to them at birth. Okay, this is predicated on a distinction between sex and gender. Sex being the biological binary of one's genitals and genetics, using the term male and female, right? And then gender being the psychological identity of the self, using the terms man and woman, right? So sex uses the terms male and female, refers to the physical. Gender uses the terms man and woman and refers to the internal gender identity that the person identifies with. So, as the story goes, transgender individuals psychologically identify with the gender opposite of their natal biology or their assigned sex at birth, right? And a transgender man is an individual who is born as a female with female genitalia and genetics who has chosen to identify as a male or a man. A traditional man, conversely, whose gender and sex are aligned, is called a cisgender, from the Latin prefix cis, which just broadly connotes, that two objects are aligned or that they're on the same side of something. So today we will explore the plausible philosophical accounts of gender and thereby transgenderism and the ways in which each of these accounts is either internally inconsistent with the transgender concept or conceptually contradictory to the leftist political ideology which purports to be its champion. There are three philosophical ways we can conceive of gender misalignment, and these three philosophical perspectives are rooted in more fundamental conceptions of the human person, what a person is and how a person's consciousness relates to their body and stuff like that. So these three philosophical positions are thus: metaphysical realism, social constructivism, and monadic materialism. Okay, so something oriented toward the metaphysical, something that emphasizes the socially constructed nature of gender, and one that emphasizes, well, all there is material, and gender and sex are the same. Okay, so we'll dig into these more in a second. Each of these three philosophical perspectives equips transgenderism with a different set of tools in order to achieve the strategy of answering the question, what does it mean to have a gender? Or more philosophically, what is the essence of one's gender? Okay, so the first category is metaphysical realism, known popularly among philosophers as a Cartesian substance dualism, because Descartes was the first one to sort of argue for that the mind was an existing thing, and he was the first sort of Enlightenment philosopher to still advocate for a version of dualism, which is to say the person is constituted not only by the material but by some immaterial thing which really is and exists more than a social construct, right? So metaphysical realism proposes that there is a categorical distinction within a person between what is materially substantive about them and what is immaterially substantive about them. So if you take, for example, the concept of consciousness or the mind, a metaphysical realist would say that the mind is something which really exists as an object in the universe, and that it has its own faculties and powers and operations and quiddities and qualities and indispensable properties and all that stuff, right? So in other words, for the metaphysical realist, materiality is not a precondition for existence. An individualized entity can exist without having a material constitution, namely being the mind. Is it real? Is it a thing? Does it have a substance in the universe? Not just the brain, but the mind itself, which is an immaterial reality. Does it exist? Or is it just a construct? It's more than a construct. According to the metaphysical realist, it exists. So Thomas Nagel, a philosopher and ethicist at New York University, NYU, distinguishes between two aspects of the human consciousness, and he uses two Greek letters to signify these aspects of the consciousness. The psi, which is, if you're familiar with psychology, that's like it comes from, it's the first word in the Greek word psychos, which later became the foundation for the concept of the mind, right? But psi, PSI, which is a mental event like pain or taste sensation, right? So you have the psi, and then you have the phi, which is the first word in physios, or physiology. It's the body, right? So phi is the corresponding physical event in the central nervous system, right? So and let me just distinguish for Nagel a little bit more. Let me nuance this position. So we use these categories of psi, which is the mental event, phi, which is the physical event. So take, for example, the mental event of taste, right? So what is the psi of taste and what is the phi of taste? We're tempted to say, well, the phi of taste is what happens in the taste buds on the tongue. And the psi is what happens in the neurobiology of the brain. That's the psi event. Nagel is saying, no. He's saying something more profound. He's actually making a metaphysical dualist claim here. And what he's saying is that the phi is what happens neurobiologically in the brain. The psi is the actual mental experience of taste. What is that? It's mental. It's psychological. It's something it's metaphysical. It's more than physical, right? So you have to understand the distinction between psi and phi isn't between what happens in the brain and what happens in the body. The distinction is between what happens in the mind and what happens in the brain, and then what happens in the body, right? So you can almost call this phi 1, phi 2. But psi is the mental event, right? And we could draw an analogy here for gender and sex, right? The metaphysical realist transgender advocate might say that, well, my phi is genetically and my genitals are male, but my psi is the alternative sex. It's the alternate sex, right? I may be physically a male. I may be phi as a male, but psi, I'm a woman, right? So you could say this is one philosophical account for transgenderism, a way of conceiving it, right? Well, let's just put that in our pocket for a second. The second category is social constructivism. Now, social constructivism proposes that gender is a social construct. So it's not something that exists metaphysically in the psi realm, but is rather a social construct, right? And this view incentivizes people to stop speaking about so-called masculinity and femininity as if they were metaphysically real, but rather to speak about constructed masculinities, because the notion that masculinity is actually a thing out there to which we are accountable to know it as an object in the universe is a farce, is a delusion. It's not real, according to the social constructivists, right? And this movement was created by postmodern and sort of literary critical approaches to gender that sought to deconstruct the boundaries on behalf of men and women who fell outside the margins of cultural norms, right? So on the one hand, a social constructivist sought to deconstruct the concept of masculinity so that, for example, homosexuals could be brought into the fold of masculinity. So that instead of saying, oh, bro, you're so gay, that's so gay, and homosexuality is bad, they say, well, that's a toxic version of masculinity. Let's construct a better version that includes homosexuality so that men could consider themselves manly homosexuals without a contradiction in terms, right? So that was the purpose of social constructivism, was in fact to reconstruct these concepts in order to fit a more inclusive and liberal agenda. And likewise, on the female side of things, to liberate women from traditionalist conceptions of gender, which socialize them into submission or housekeeping or something like that, rather than letting them go become CEOs or whatever it is that women wanted to do at that time, who were second-wave feminists. So in this construal, transgender individuals have been irrevocably socialized as having a misaligned gender identification, which serves to justify gender transition strategies, right? So transitioning genders in this perspective simply serves to accommodate more comfortably one's socialized self-conception of having a gender that is alternative to their natal or assigned sex, right? So the first option was in a metaphysically realist way. If gender is the psi, it's the metaphysical, then transgender is a misalignment of the phi and the psi. And in the social constructivist category, you instead have somebody who is born with a male body, for instance, but socialized as self-identifying as a female. So the resultant gender self-identification is a product of socialization, since these categories are all just socially constructed anyway. So third, in the monadic materialist conception of gender, manhood and womanhood are strictly identified with maleness and femaleness because it's monadic. It's not realist, it's not dualist, it's monadic. It's everything is material, sort of a Sam Harris atheist materialist perspective. And in this conception, a trans person is simply one who is genetically and sexually a particular sex, who hormonally and surgically alters their body in order to aesthetically align it with the alternative gender, right? So monadic materialism is similar to metaphysical realism in that it views gender as a real thing. It's not just a social construct, but what monadic materialism does is that it would not admit to a distinction between the psi and the phi. It would say there is no such thing as a psi. The mind is just what happens in the brain. There's nothing metaphysically further than that, or above that, or out there, right? Instead, whatever happens physically, whatever is physically apparent in terms of the individual, is the case for their gender. So in this regard, gender reassignment surgery really does accomplish a transition of gender insofar as the physical constitutes the metaphysical. And in the monadic materialist view, physical alteration actually constitutes a metaphysical alteration in a manner of speaking, even if sexual reassignment does not achieve sort of a genetic credibility just because we haven't scientifically got ourselves there yet, right? So in the monadic materialist view, what you are sexually is what you are in terms of your engenderment, simply because there is no metaphysical space within the monadic materialist view to make a distinction between sex and gender, right? So conceived in any of these perspectives, in isolation, transgenderism is at least conceivable. And as an idea, as sort of absurd and twisted as it is to normalize this idea, it is not difficult to grasp. But each of these philosophical options for conceiving of gender, and thereby transgenderism, has really devastating consequences for the left and actually leaches onto conservatism in a way that cannot survive. So we're going to go back through each of these philosophical perspectives and see in what way they are either internally contradictory or contradict with leftist ideology, which champions them. So first, if we conceive of transgenderism in a metaphysically realist way, starting from the top, right? If we conceive of transgenderism and gender in a metaphysically realist way, then we establish the strongest case for gender realignment surgery. Because if a male has a male body in terms of phi, and yet is a woman in terms of psi, and this is the strongest philosophical justification for modifying phi to fit psi, because there is actually an object that is misaligned out there, which is a metaphysical one. And this is just assuming that the alteration of the psi is not an option. And I don't know why it wouldn't be. In fact, we might point out, well, now that if, let's say that the metaphysical realist account is true and holds, and transgenderism does actually occur because metaphysical realism is true, then it would be sort of dubious to say, well, let's just do a sex reassignment surgery and modify the phi instead of why wouldn't you just modify the psi? Why not modify the psychical aspect or end of the misalignment? It doesn't totally make sense to me why you wouldn't do that, because it has less irrevocable consequences, and it would seem a little bit like a softer aspect of change. It would be more, the mind would be more malleable. But if an individual is metaphysically a woman and yet physically a male, then this metaphysical realist category would at least explain the disjunction. It would at least allow us to classify transgenderism as a legitimate metaphysical and physical disjunction. And this would explain why a surgery might be appropriate. And I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying here's a category of explanation, even though it says nothing of whether this metaphysical claim is in fact true. So how would you verify if there's a gender misalignment, right? Which is an entirely separate critique of genderism, right? So if there is such a thing as metaphysical maleness and femaleness, then, which the transgender would adopt in order to give metaphysical or philosophical credibility to their need for reassignment surgery, then this completely undercuts the second wave and third wave feminist claim that there's nothing distinctly different about women from men, right? So if gender is a metaphysical reality to which individuals are accountable, then gender operates out of and in accountability to these notions of gender, right? So the definition of man and woman would not be up for debate, because there would be an object with indispensable properties, and in an Aristotelian sense, these properties would need to constitute themselves metaphysically within each person in order to qualify the person to count themselves as trans at all. You see what I'm saying? So if you make this argument for trans, you actually destroy the second wave, third wave feminist point that, well, the only thing different about men and women is their genetics and their genitalia. Besides that, we're all just individuals. Or if you make this trans argument, you say, no, actually, there's something called maleness metaphysically and femaleness metaphysically, and what you are constitutes that, and you're actually accountable to conform to the metaphysical form which you embody, right? Which is femaleness if you're born a female, right? So all that to say, if you're going to own womanness, and there is such a thing metaphysically as womanhood, well, then you're obligated to conform to that, right? It is accountable to you. If it is binding for gender reassignment surgery for somebody who's misaligned, right, that you do everything to align them, then as a woman, if you are a cisgender female and you are a woman, then you ought to likewise have a sense of urgency about conforming to metaphysical womanhood. But most women don't want to do that, or they don't want to think along that line of thinking. They don't want to think about metaphysically the way that men and women are different, because you too easily head toward a matriarchy or a patriarchy, right? So the point here is that the strongest explanatory account of transgenderism completely undercuts the philosophy of feminism, which is that men and women are metaphysically indistinguishable in role, in kind, and capacity. So in other words, if the philosophical legitimation of transgenderism were true, then cisgendered populations would be philosophically bound to traditionalism and conservatism. And it is essentially an Aristotelian justification that wins one battle for the political left and loses all the other battles for the political left. Okay, so that's one way in which adopting a metaphysical realist account of transgenderism serves transgenderism in a way that ultimately undercuts the ideology which fetishizes it. Okay, second, if we take the social constructivist account of gender, then one's sense of identification with a gender other than one's natal sex is merely a matter of socialization. And this makes the process of aligning the gender and their sex merely a matter of socialization, and it makes the very concept of gender a matter of social construct, and at the same time philosophically removes any impetus for gender reassignment. So if manhood and womanhood are simply social constructs which are not ethically binding on individuals, then this empties the urgency and legitimation of gender reassignment surgery completely. So if an individual is born a male and identifies as a woman, why not just remain a male and shift your definition of a woman to having male genitals and doing traditionally male things, right? And this is another way that transgenderism goes against the grain of leftist ideology, is that transgenderism is really predicated on a modernist realist conception of gender, and to conceive of gender as a social construct raises two questions. One, why let a social construct have so much power over you that you actually surgically remove your sex organs? And two, if you suffer from gender dysphoria, why not just socialize your conception of misaligned gender into alignment with your physical gender? If gender is just a social construct, then the idea of transgenderism is actually a problem that's easy to be fixed through psychological socialization. Okay? And it's much easier to socialize somebody, and has much less irrevocable consequences to socialize somebody than it does to actually surgically remove the genitals and put them on hormone therapy, especially children, which we're going to get to in a second. Of course, asking these questions will do no use because leftists aren't interested in consistency. They are blinded by their passion for accumulating victim cards, and the trans community is a token oppressed community on the margins of normal society upon which leftists capitalize to make middle-class white women feel morally superior to their conservative friends. That's all it is. So third, if we take the monadic materialist conception of gender, right? And so we've gone through metaphysical realist, social constructivist. If we take the monadic materialist conception of gender, that one's sex is one's gender because it's an enclosed and simple, the universe is enclosed and simplified by its exhaustive materiality, right? Then the power to change one's gender loses its very rationale. If all you are is a cluster of atoms and you feel like your gender is misaligned with your sex, well, then you're simply mistaken. You're scientifically mistaken. You're biologically mistaken. There is no philosophical or intellectual space in a monadic view and likewise in a materialist view of the universe for there to be misalignment. Okay? The human person is, in this sense, conceived as a metaphysically simple entity, meaning that there are no real distinctions between a person's sex and gender. There's no metaphysical space to make that distinction. And the power to change one's gender in a monadic materialist scheme through physically altering sex markers can provide no rationale to take such an option, okay? There can be no dysphoria between gender and sex because in a materialist view, or if you're a trans materialist or if you're a trans monist, it doesn't make any sense because gender is sex. So one may undergo gender reassignment surgery in a monadic materialist framework under the delusion that reassignment surgery is actually accomplishing a gender reassignment, which it does most potently in the monadic materialist view. But such an action is both grave and philosophically unjustified because you are what you are, okay? And that's not to make a metaphysical argument, and that's not to make a social constructivist argument. It's saying if you're a materialist, if you are trans and you're going to make an option, or if you're a trans advocate and you want to justify the option of sex reassignment surgery, what philosophical categories are you going to use to account for that? What philosophical categories are you going to use to explain and to justify that option? So far, metaphysical dualism doesn't work. Social constructivism doesn't work. Monadic materialism doesn't work. The urge to surgically remove one's sex markers, especially in the monadic materialist view, which is the only philosophical perspective in which gender reassignment surgery means anything, ought to be treated as a compulsion to self-mutilate and therefore as a disorder rather than a dysphoria. And I would say that ultimately ought to be the case for no matter what philosophical perspective you took, because as I just laid out, people want to say, oh, your gender's misaligned. What are you talking about? What are you even talking about? What are you even saying? If you ask these people to explain what they're talking about philosophically or in clear categories, or to categorize or classify what they mean when they say they're trans, they simply cannot do it. It is a joke. It is a joke. Okay? It is a farce. A recent meta-analysis of 10 prospective follow-up studies found that for children who met the criteria for gender dysphoria, 80% of these cases of dysphoria receded when they went through puberty, meaning that the body's natural hormone therapy that every individual experiences actually eases a sense of dysphoria of gender, or eases a sense of dysphoria, or eases the sense of gender misalignment. The body's natural hormone therapy aligns one's sense of sex and gender. So in other words, if children are confused by misinforming educators and media, which is very common, one study, and I'll put that in the footnotes here in this article, one study found that the role of these leftist scripts, which are perpetuated by left-leaning educators and left-leaning media, are one of the reasons that young pre-adolescent and adolescent children self-identify as trans, because they buy these scripts from the people who influence them in their lives. And so if one of these children does buy into one of these leftist scripts and self-identifies as trans, right, and they buy into one of these absurd trans scripts of self-identification, the good thing is that we're seeing from these meta-analyses is that with the right social support from parents, this sense of dysphoria will dissolve, that this will naturally go away. And but you have to be engaged, and you have to be supportive, not necessarily of the trans path, but supportive of the person. And you have to be patient with, okay, their body is doing work on your behalf if you're a conservative. Okay? And the problem isn't with heteronormativity, and it's not with cisnormativity. The problem is with the normalization of these scripts for children by the media and leftist public school teachers who will tell kids that being trans puts you in a special praiseworthy group that deserves attention and admiration. Okay? The most common cases of transgenderism, the most common cases of adolescent transgenderism are among young girls who identify as young boys, comprising up to 90% of some of the largest clinical samples. And this means that young boys comprise the surge in transgenderism since the early 2000s to a far lesser degree than young girls do. More than that, adolescents who report non-cisgender identity or trans identity come disproportionately often from very poor families with high rates of unemployment and low-paying jobs. What does this mean? It means that transgenderism is a predatory leftist idea that statistically preys upon and destroys lower-income little girls. Just like the unborn, these are victims of Obama-era leftism that need political and ideological protection from politically hypnotized parents that abuse their children by encouraging or allowing their adolescent and pre-adolescent gender reassignment. It is cruel and should be criminal. There's one medical doctor, Stephen Rosenthal, who's a transgender supporter and professor of pediatrics. He writes in the Oxford publication, The Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, basically the status quo among transition-oriented medical professionals right now, and he makes 2 points. Number one, gender transition should occur as early as possible. Number two, all procedures must be accompanied by an education of the patient about the issues in order to ensure that they are acting out of informed consent. Can you just take a moment and realize what this doctor just said? That a child needs to make the decision to surgically remove their genitals and undergo hormone therapy with informed consent. You know what the problem is with that? Children can't consent. That's why statutory rape is a crime. That's why a 40-year-old can't have sex with a 13-year-old under any condition. Okay? Adolescents, and especially pre-adolescents, cannot give consent. In this way, leftist political ideology is harmful not only to children with gender dysphoria who want to undergo the irrevocable and harmful transition process, but it actually sets a legal precedent for consent that could very well erode the hard line that protects minors from sexual predators. We need to say that children cannot give consent and therefore cannot undergo trans therapy. It cannot happen. And the people who really pay the price for the left's insanity about transgenderism are children. But this is perfectly rational and consistent for them because the left has never cared about children. Okay? Encouraging pre-adolescent gender reassignment fits hand in glove with late-term abortions. Ideologically, it's a perfect fit. It makes sense. It is the ultimate and extreme end of wanting to avoid the stiff moral conservatism of the 1990s and become America's cool party, right? But the left has taken tolerance to such an extreme that it has been consumed in chaos and has no boundaries or borders at all. Hey man, you want to transition from being a boy to a girl? Yeah, let's do it. We're America's cool party. We're not like those moral majority evangelicals over there. No, we care about you. Let's have a march. You want to remove your genitals? You're 12? Let's do it. Let's pass a law and make it so that your parents can't do anything about it if you want to do it. Just absurd. Just absurd. Okay? The left has taken tolerance to such an extreme. It has been consumed. It is eating its own, it is a snake eating its own tail. Leftism is a snake eating its own tail. Its product that it proffers is a sense of moral aggravation and smug self-righteousness to middle-class whites and a psychologically stunting sense of victimhood to ethnic and sexual minorities. And you can't say that gender is so conceptually ephemeral that traditional gender norms ought to be redefined to fit each individual's constitution, and at the same time say that gender is something so metaphysically real and binding that individuals ought to change their fundamental physical constitution to accommodate the morphological and normative constraints of genderment. You cannot hold both of those things at the same time. But this all culminates in an important point, which is ultimately the profound difference between conservatives and leftists, okay? Conservatives are actually trying to build a rational system which is accountable to the truth and rejects postmodernism for the most part, right? And leftism isn't trying to build anything. They just jump from issue to issue, trying to win as many political issues as possible. They're like the Joker from The Dark Knight. Do I really look like a guy with a plan, right? Like, look at your average leftist. Talk to them. Listen to the words coming out of their mouth. It's literally nonsense. It's gibberish. Leftist speech is just verbal slush that's strewn with aggravated moral accusations against anyone who disagrees with them. Man, you're racist, sexist, bigot, homophobe, xenophobe, yada, yada, yada. I don't care. I don't care. Do leftists speak like principled, rational people? They do not. Do they speak as if they have a coherent system that they're trying to defend? They do not. The very ideology that makes possible the leftist deconstruction of traditional values is postmodernism. Literally by definition, Philosophy 101, postmodernism is an incredulity toward meta-narratives. Their entire system is anti-coherence. They are just going to keep throwing accelerant on the dumpster fire that is leftist ideology, no matter who pays the cost. Even small children, small, low-income, impoverished little girls who hear their teachers peddling this abusive and ridiculous notion and see on TV people peddling this ridiculous notion that transgenderism is common and normal and acceptable and harmless. It is not. It is uncommon, it is unnatural, it is unacceptable, and it is very harmful. And it's false. When you speak to a trans man, you are neither speaking to a trans individual or a man in any sense. You are speaking to a cisgendered woman who is judging you for not buying into her delusions. You're speaking to a person with a mental illness. You're speaking to someone who needs help and who is being manipulated, abused, and underserved and politically used by leftism.